But my slides are on the screen, so we're doing okay so far. So it's really great to be here because I'm actually a Geordie. I don't sound like one. I've been down south for long enough that my accent is sort of drifting down and joining me. I don't know, somewhere around Yorkshire maybe at the moment. But I was born and brought up in Newcastle and Gateshead, so I don't have much reason to come up here anymore. I don't have family here now, but it's really nice to come back and have a look around, and things have changed a lot in the 20 or so years since I went down to London. But a little bit about me, if you want to look up some of the things I do. Most of the stuff is at rachelchallenge.co.uk, and I'm constantly complaining about aeroplanes on Twitter. So you can find me there. I sometimes talk about CSS as well when I'm not talking about aeroplanes. As I say, I'm a CSS Working Group invited expert. I'm not like most of the CSS Working Group people are from browser vendors and other people who implement CSS. There are a few of us who have just sort of been brought on because we're people who know a bit about CSS and actually write CSS. And so that's why I'm there. So I do various things. But my day job is Perch CMS. So that's what I do to earn money. So I've been actually working on the web since 1996, which dates me. It means that I'm old enough to remember when we were arguing about whether we should use CSS at all, or whether we should be using font tags. And I was using CSS for layout when people were telling me that I was an idiot and I should be using tables. So I've been doing this for kind of a long time. And I was part of the Web Standards project back then. Actually part of the Dreamweaver task force, which we were trying to encourage Macromedia, who had Dreamweaver at the time, to support standards in that authoring tool. And really my interest in the stuff I'm going to tell you about today dates back to working with Dreamweaver and looking at visual layout and how we do layout visually. Because the thing is that CSS has got really, really neat. There's all this stuff that we can now do with sort of native CSS, we don't even need JavaScript for, and things that we would have done with Flash, perhaps in the past. And all of this would have really blown my mind 10 years ago, never mind 20 years ago. But there's one part of designing for the web which kind of got stuck. It got stuck, I don't know, somewhere around 2006. And that's layout. And we're using layout now, which was never designed for full-page layout of complex applications. Things like floats, inline block positioning, they were for laying out academic documents. They were never designed for laying out the sort of stuff that we try and do today. And that's why layout is hard, and it is fragile, and we rely on frameworks and things, because who wants to be working out the calculations for how wide every column should be? That's really boring. So that's why where we are today is really because we're having to deal with this very fragile system that we've built on top of stuff that was never designed for doing layout. But things are changing. And we've got this group of CSS modules that have kind of come about to redefine how we do layout on the web. And we've got Flexbox. I'm sure a lot of people are already using Flexbox. We've got Grid Layout. And they're kind of tied together by a module called Box Alignment, which you might not have heard the name of, but you're definitely using if you're already using Flexbox. And so today I'm going to talk about Grid primarily, because we're in a very interesting time for Grid. But I think a lot of this stuff that we look at will be familiar if you've already started using Flexbox. And I'll talk about browser support and where we are with Grid later on. But a lot of the things, all the code and things in my slides at the moment, for the next month anyway, you'll need to enable flags if you're using a current copy of Chrome or Firefox. If you're using Nightly's or Chrome Canary, all of this stuff will just work. So, Grid Layout. I'm going to start by explaining a few things about it, and then later on, then we'll have a break, and I'll move on to showing you some sort of worked examples. As I say, all the code's in my slide, it's all CodePen links, you can have a look later. So first, we create a grid. We create a grid by using a new value of the display property. So just like display flex, we've got display grid. You can also say inline grid. And immediately, any direct child of the element that you've said is a grid, that becomes a grid item. So that's just the same as with Flexbox. You say display flex, things become flex items. And we then create grid tracks, and we do this with grid template columns and grid template rows. So what I'm doing here is creating a 3-column, 3-row grid. And the child elements will just lay themselves out automatically. They'll go one into each grid cell. If I want to space them out, we can specify a grid gap, and that's with the grid gap property, and it's a shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. Works like the column gap in multi-column layout. And we're creating a fixed width layout here with pixels. But grid layout was created for a responsive web, as with Flexbox, so it allows the creation of flexible grids. And to do that, we've got this new unit, the FR unit. And if you know how flex basis works in Flexbox, it's very, very familiar to you. This unit, it assigns a fraction of the available space in the grid container to a track. So if I say I've got 3 1FR unit tracks, I've got 3 equal width tracks. And no matter how wide or narrow that container gets, I'm still going to have those 3 tracks. They're going to share the space. They'll grow and shrink in proportion. And we can change those proportions, so I can assign different fractions to each tracks. So I've got 2 here of 1FR and 1 of 2FR. So the available space in the container divided into 4, and we have 1 part each for the first 2 and 2 parts for the third one. Now the nice thing about fraction units rather than percentages is that because you're assigning a fraction of available space, you can mix it with fixed width columns. So I can have a 500 pixel fixed column, and then I've got the rest of the space, whatever that is, depending on how wide the container is, and that's shared out between these 2 columns. One is 1FR, the other is 2FR. So the available space is split into 3 and shared out. We've got some little bits of syntax here. We've got this repeat function, and that basically means you can have a repeating pattern of tracks, and instead of having to write them all out individually, you can use the repeat syntax. So if I say repeat 3, 1FR, then that's exactly the same as writing out 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And imagine if you've got a 16-column layout all equal width, it saves you writing out each of those. Now we don't actually need to declare row tracks in this example. If we leave them out, Grid will just create rows as needed for our items. These created rows or columns, if you place something outside in a column that's outside of what you've declared, they're described as the implicit grid. So the explicit grid is the one that you create using grid template columns, grid template rows. But Grid will just cope with you sticking things into places that don't exist on that grid. Those rows and columns will be auto-sized by default, so they'll just be the right size to fit the content. But you can actually specify a size with grid auto rows and grid auto columns. And those actually will take a track list. So you can say, well, the first implicit row that's created should be 100 pixels tall and the second should be auto, or whatever you want. So I showed you the repeat syntax, which specified a fixed number of repeating tracks. But you can actually ask Grid to add as many tracks of a certain size as will fit into the container, using the autofill or autofit keyword. You can even create flexible tracks using min-max. So I've set the minimum size to 200 pixels and the max to 1 fraction unit, meaning that you get as many 200 pixel tracks as will fit into the container, and the remaining space will be shared out between those tracks. So you get these flexible tracks that never collapse down to 0. So that's pretty neat, because you can have a layout that remains in strict rows and columns, but it still flexes and allows as many things to fit in to the container as you need. So I've shown you lots of things about Grid here, and we've not actually talked about positioning anything on the grid. Everything has just been flown into a grid, and it's displaying itself with the auto placement rules. And we'll have a look a bit more at auto placement later. But we can also start to position things on the grids that we're creating. So we can create a grid, and then we can say, well, I've got this stuff, these direct children of the grid element, and say where exactly you want them on your grid. And before we do that, there's a little bit more terminology. There is a huge amount of new terminology in the grid spec, because it's a big spec, it does things that we haven't been able to do before. And so there's lots of new bits and pieces to sort of get your head around. So when we talk about grids, we talk about tracks on the grid, and a grid track is the space between 2 grid lines, and that could be a column or it could be a row. So that's a track. And once we've defined tracks, so in our grid template columns or grid template rows, we're actually defining the size of the track. But by defining a track, we get lines. So a grid with 3 column tracks has 4 lines, because you've got one on the end as well. These are numbered, starting with line 1. They can also be named, which we'll have a little look at in a minute. If you've got a gap, that acts just like a fat line. So it's as if the line has got wider. So you can't position anything into a gap. Something that's worth noting is that grid lines are indexed according to the writing mode of your document. So if you are working in English, you are working in a left to right language. So grid line 1 is on the left hand side of your grid. That's going to be flipped if you are working in a right to left language. Most of the sort of modern CSS specs care about writing modes. It's something that we care about now because we've realized that the web isn't all in English and in a left to right language. And so there's a lot of things that seem a little bit complex when you look at them, and it's because we're trying to cope with the fact that you have different writing modes in documents. Sometimes you have mixed writing modes in documents. You have some left to right and some top to bottom. And that's something that these things try to cope with. So then we have grid cells, and conceptually that's just like a table cell. It's the smallest unit that you could have on your grid between 4 lines. But with grid layout you can join those cells together into areas, and that's any area on the grid bound by 4 grid lines. So that can include many grid cells. It needs to be rectangular. We can't create sort of Tetris shaped areas on our grid just yet, maybe in the future. So let's have a look at positioning things. So here I'm using that repeat syntax, and I'm creating a grid with 3 column tracks of 1 fraction unit each. My rows are being created at 200 pixels tall, so by default my blocks just lay out on that grid. But if I position the cards, I can position that first card starting at grid column line 1 and ending at column line 4, row 1 to row 3. So that's the large block on the right. The other 2 items will just position themselves in the space left with these auto placement rules. Now we can collapse that down to a shorthand. So this is the shorthand. So here I'm saying grid column, and the number before the forward slash is your start line, the number after is your end line. Same for rows. I know the slashes look really weird to people. It's you kind of run out of things to use in CSS as a separator. The slash does look a bit like a division when you're working with numbers, unfortunately. But that's what we've gone with. You can actually write that out as one line of CSS with grid area. The order of those values is grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end, which is actually the reverse of specifying margin and padding shorthands. And this comes down to writing modes again. It kind of had to be in a logical way for somebody, and so that was what was decided. So that's line numbers. You've always got line numbers on your grid, but you can also name the lines and then refer to the lines by name rather than number, which is a bit easier than figuring out exactly which line something is on the grid, particularly if you redefine your grid at different breakpoints. So if you want to name your lines, you do that within the square brackets, and then you have the size of the track. And remember that we're naming lines here, not the tracks. So then when you position things using them, you're going to use the line name rather than the number, which looks like this. So you're using that name that you've decided instead of the number. You've always still got the number if you want to use that as well. Now you can name your lines anything you like, really, but if you name them dash start and dash end, grid will create a named grid area of the main name used, and this looks entirely baffling. I'll show you some more examples later which may kind of bring it into view as to how this works, but you can position an item right into that area using the grid area name. So what I've done here is I've called these, I've got something that's main end, main start. That's going to create an area called main. And you can also create these named areas explicitly too, which gives us another positioning possibility. So I've named each card this time with the grid area property. And then instead of doing any line-based positioning, I use grid template areas and describe my layout in ASCII art, which is pretty neat. I'll show you some more examples of this. I really like this method, and I've been prototyping with this for about 3 years, really ever since we got this into Chrome, sort of in Chrome Canary behind flags. I've been using this as a prototyping method for interface design. I have to go back and rebuild the stuff in things that work in modern browsers, but it's a really nice way because you can just move things around. It's a lovely way to play with responsive layouts. I think that this, as strange as it looks, will become very, very popular once we've got it in browsers. But there is an awful lot of magic here. It's a lot of new stuff. And I've rattled through all that mainly so that you've got those slides, you can have a look at them later and sort of see how those different bits work. But let's have a look at some examples, some things that you might be trying to build and see how we use grid in those contexts. And we'll start with line-based placement. So I'm going to create a 2-column layout. And it looks a bit like this. Now you could build that with pretty much anything today. So we'll have a look at how we do that with grid. That's the HTML. I've got a parent with a class of wrapper and 3 child elements. And if we don't give it any layout, it looks like this. So everything's just laying out as you'd expect in document order. So I'm going to create my grid now. So I've created 2 columns, 2 fraction units and 4 fraction units. So I'm dividing the available space into 6 and assigning it in those proportions. We've got some gaps to create gaps between my columns and rows. And having done that, I get this. So I've not positioned anything, but grid tries not to make things all stack up in the corner. So what it's doing is using the auto placement, it's just laying the blocks out, laying the child elements out in empty cells to try and make things readable, even if you don't do anything with it. But then I want to create my layout, and I do that with line-based placement. So I start the header starts at column line 1, ends at 3, it goes in grid row 1. If things only span one track, you don't need to have the end line because the default is to span one track. So the panel starts at column line 1 and the content sits next to it at column line 2. And that's it, that's my layout. And it looks like this. And the panel there, I don't know if you can see well on this screen, it looks all right. You can see it's got a grey background which takes full height, and that's because the panel and the main content are in the same row. And the default is stretch, just like with Flexbox, so the panel is going to extend all the way to the bottom, unlike with floats where that background would sit up behind your text. And it's this ability for things to react to other elements on the grid that makes this so powerful. So if we overlay the grid there, you can see how the elements are sitting according to grid lines. And again, those fat lines are just like a skinny line. The content starts afterwards. Later, I'll post these slides later. You'll be able to find that example. So if I want to put a footer on the layout, I just add it to my markup. And I say that I'd like that to stretch right across the grid and go in grid row 3. And there it is. It doesn't need clearing, it can't pop up over the content, it doesn't matter which column above it is longest because it's in its own row. It's always going to stay below the columns above. We didn't actually declare any rows that we were adding things to. As I mentioned before, if you keep on adding things into rows, you'll just get new rows and they'll just be auto-sized. So you don't need to declare all of your grid carefully. You don't need to have rows that are just auto. They're going to be auto by default. So grid will just create those auto-sized rows as you position elements. Now when I'm showing this to people, they say, you know, this is a bit like table-based layout. Anyone who's old like me, they're like, this is a bit like using a table. But of course, unlike using a table, grid doesn't rely on your content being in a particular order. And because you're described in CSS, you can redefine these layouts and you can change things around at different breakpoints, which you can't do with a table. So if we wanted to make our layout responsive, we could define a single column grid to start with, and perhaps just use that to reorder some of the content if we wanted to, which would give us something like this at narrow widths. And then we redefine the grid in our media queries and also position our elements so that we go back to that 2-column layout that we had before. So grid makes it pretty easy to move stuff around based on media queries. And we've looked at using these line numbers, and I mentioned that we could use named lines. So we'll have a look at how our layout looks if we start naming the lines. So again, this is just the same layout and the same markup. So this time, when I create my single column layout here, I'm just naming the row lines. And the value there, auto, is describing the grid track. And the name is for the line before or the line after in the case of the last line. So this, when we position our items, becomes this. Again, really useful for responsive design. So even as you redefine your grid, you can give things the same line name. So you don't have to remember to keep track of where your numbers are. And then we had those named areas. So this is using the grid template areas property. And once again, we'll have a look at the exact same layout and how we would do that with named areas. So outside of any media queries, you need to assign a name to the various page elements. Again, you can name them anything you like, really, and we're using the grid area property, and we're saying the main header is called header, and so on. So we name everything. And when I set up my grid for the mobile width layout, this is the single column with the rows. Instead of positioning the item with its own rules, I just create the layout as the value of the grid template areas property. So that basically is it. That's my layout. I've said I've got this grid, it's got these properties, and this is my layout. It looks like this. So that's it. So we end up with a narrow layout, and that's it, what it looks like with the named template areas overlaid. And this looks a bit more obvious when we go to something with 2 columns. So that's the wider layout inside the media queries. So again, I'm just describing my layout in this ASCII art manner. So we get this layout with the named template areas overlaid. As I say, really nice way to work. You can play around with this stuff, you can move things around really easily, and a very nice way to work with the team. You know, it's very obvious. You can look at what the layout looks like. You can see it there in the code. If you repeat a name, that causes it to span cells. So where the header stretches right across the top, you can see that I've repeated that. As with creating any area in any way, the area has to be rectangular. We can't have like an L-shaped area at this point. You can have multiple white space characters in between those repeated areas, so you can line up your ASCII art. If you want to leave a cell empty, just use a full stop character, or multiple full stops with no space in between, again, for the purposes of lining up your ASCII art. So if on the bottom there I have a full stop and then only mention footer once, that means the footer will just sit under the content and not span, and we'll get empty space. And this is a nice thing with grid. You can have white space. You can have white space wherever you like on your grid. Nothing's going to rise up and fill up that space. And I mentioned these implicit named lines and areas briefly at the beginning. So something that happens when we name areas is you get lines for free. You get named lines too. So that's the layout. And then below that, I've got an area named test. And I've said I'm going to start that on grid column content start. And then it's going to start on row content start and end on row footer end. And that gives us this. We've sort of dropped this block on top of the content, and we've used named lines that we didn't name, but because we've got an area called content, we've got content start and content end on both rows and columns. This also shows you can layer items on your grid, and they just work with Z-index just the same as absolute positioned items, so you can stack stuff up. So that works really nicely if you want to, layer things. You could layer things with different transparency and so on, and get some quite nice effects. So, they were some very simple examples, but I think that when most people think of grid systems, you think of the 12 and 16 column grid systems that we get into the Bootstrap and Foundation and so on. And that was really the first thing I wanted to do when I looked at grid. I'm like, well, can we reproduce these things? So, this is example code from Bootstrap. You see, we end up with an awful lot of stuff. We're essentially describing our layout in markup when we do this. I know obviously you can get away from that by using Sass and so on, but it can be quite a heavy way to work, conceptually quite a heavy way to work, because you're having to describe layout in some way before it really gets rendered to the screen. So the nice thing with grid layout is because we're doing everything in CSS, we can describe that, and it says we can add new breakpoints at any time and redefine the description. But it does mean that when we need to think about, well, can I replace Bootstrap with grid layout, we're actually looking at a sort of different way of working. We're working the other way around, rather than just trying to map what we know about Bootstrap onto grid. So to kind of show that, this is a grid layout called Skeleton. I don't know if people might have come across that. It works in a similar way to Bootstrap. It's just slightly lighter weight, so it kind of makes for an easier demo. It's a bit cleaner. So this is the markup for the skeleton grid. You can see we have to add divs for rows and then state in the class the number of columns a column can span. So it's pretty much like the rest of these things. And that little example there, it creates a grid that looks like this. So it's just a little demo of the different sizes of the columns you can create. So that's using the skeleton grid. So how would we do this with grid layout? Well, the first thing we do is we remove the row classes. We don't need those. And we also don't need to describe our grid in the markup. So we could, here I've just called these things box 1, box 2. I've got no semantics, but you could be using semantic class names if you wanted. The important thing is I've removed all description of how our grid works from the markup. And then I create my grid. So I'm using the repeat keyword here to create a grid with 12 columns. I've also named those lines, which means that I have multiple lines named col, for instance. And this turns out to be quite useful, because we can place items on the grid using the named lines syntax. So with box 1, I want it to start on col. That'll be the first line named col. And I'm saying span 4. And then I want that on the first line named row. And that's going to put my box, you can see the highlighted box there, that's going to sit there. So if we look at something that's further down in the grid, this is box 8. So we start on column line 7, spanning 3 lines. So col 7 is column line 7, where we've got the same line names. So we don't need to worry about which line of the grid the third line after column line 7 is. We just know we want to span 3 column tracks. And so I can go around and position all the items, and we end up with this. I say this is all online, you can have a look at it later. But grid lets us go one step further, and that's to also control the grid rows. So we can span rows in exactly the same way that we span columns. And this is something that's really, really difficult to do currently with the existing layout methods we've got. And so by doing this, we end up with this third example, where I'm actually spanning across the rows as well as across columns. And you can see the heights go to the gutter no matter how much content's in the block. And that's similar to Flexbox, but we're kind of working in 2 dimensions here, not just across the row, but also, we're also down with the column as well. That is all at that URL. You can have a play around with it later. And so this is how then we would rebuild our 2-column layout using that skeleton-inspired grid. We've got our header. We say start at the first line named col and span 12. Go into the first row named row. Our main footer, again, that spans across the 12 columns. The content, we want to span 8. And the panel starts at the first column and spans 4. Which gives us this layout again, but this time using more of a traditional sort of 12-column grid. And of course you can create any kind of grid you want. If you want to have an unusual number of columns and try different kinds of columns, you can do that. And so that's all at that URL, you can have a look. So it makes it really easy to play around. So here I'm just changing where my footer sits. I'm changing the grid row end to make that span down, and I'm moving the footer over to one side. And just by changing 3 values in the CSS, we can end up with this, with the footer then moved across and the panel going all the way down. It makes it just really easy to play around with how your layout works. So that's it. That's all you need for your layout based on grid. You've not included any framework. There's no additional CSS. That is absolutely it. And the thing is, what is going to happen, and I can guarantee you what is going to happen, is that just like Flexbox, we're going to see everybody posting their grid layout based grid frameworks to GitHub. But please, if you're thinking of doing that, think about whether that abstraction actually adds anything, or whether it just adds a sort of weird layer of complexity on top of something, because a lot of the time we're not going to need a grid layout-based grid framework, because grid is a grid framework built right into CSS. Right at the beginning of the talk, I was showing examples where I was creating a grid and things were just laying themselves out sort of into the boxes, into the grid. And they were positioning themselves without us giving them any placement properties. And there's a bunch of rules around this auto placement of grid items. There's in the spec there is something called the grid item placement algorithm, which looks a bit like this, but then it goes on into all sorts of complicated things. And the thing is with CSS specs, they're actually reasonably readable once you get used to the language that's used by the CSS working group. But there's an awful lot of stuff in there which is for browser vendors, for people who are actually implementing a browser. If you want to get really, really deep into how CSS works and can be bothered to sort of plough through this language, it can actually be quite useful. You can learn an awful lot of things about how things work. Anyway, we've got this algorithm there in the spec so that implementers know how things should lay out. And not only is it useful to know this happens, because it can be very odd if things start placing themselves in weird places on your grid, you can also kind of use this to do interesting layout things. So our original example, when we created that grid and we didn't position anything, I said, well, grid's trying to lay things out without them overlapping, and it's just putting each child element into a cell of the grid, and that's what will happen if you don't do anything. But let's see how we can play with this algorithm to do an interesting layout. So I've got a list here, it's got a bunch of images in it, and the UL element there has got a class of wrapper, and that's what we're going to turn into a grid. So the children there are the list items. So I'm creating a grid with 4 equal columns on that UL, and if we do that, then we get this. So you can see there the images are laying themselves out on the grid, they're going one into each cell. Now some of those images are taller, so they're taking up the full height and they're making the height of that track. The other things, because they're in landscape format, they're sort of staying smaller. Now, it might be quite nice to have those landscape images and make them span 2 grid tracks, and that would kind of even out the proportions a bit. If it was landscape, it's going to go wider. And so I'd added a class of landscape onto the LIs that contained landscape images. And so then I can just say, for anything that's got a class of landscape, grid column ends span 2. So it doesn't matter where it starts on the grid, but it's going to span 2 tracks. And so we get this. So that's quite nice. So the grid goes along and it finds that portrait image and it puts it into the first cell. And the next one, it's got a class of landscape. So then, well, that's going to take up 2 tracks. And then we've got a gap, because the next image is also a landscape image, and obviously isn't going to fit into that little gap. So grid's like, okay, leaves the gap and just moves on to the next row. So it's progressing forward. It's keeping the elements in source order. Unless I add a property, grid auto flow, with a value of dense. Grid is now backfilling the gaps. It's moving through the content. It encounters an image that will fill a gap that's already left. It picks it up, it takes it out of DOM order, and it puts it in the space. So item 4 now comes before item 3 in the visual display, which is pretty cool for your image gallery. Not so great for your form. And I'll come back to that later. But first, this is like the #1 question that people ask me when I talk about grid. They say, is grid a competing specification to Flexbox? As if the CSS working group are sort of having some kind of CSS deathmatch between 2 specifications. Which will win? We're not. Grid's essentially one part of a new system for layout. It's a system that includes Flexbox, because there are things that Flexbox is pretty good at, which are sort of different in subtle ways to grid. The 2 specs share common features. And this is where we bring in this module that I mentioned at the start, the box alignment module. Grid uses these alignment properties that are part of the CSS box alignment module level 3. And what this module is all of the cool stuff that's in Flexbox for alignments, the stuff that makes things equal height, the stuff that lets you do things like space between. That's all defined in the box alignment module. And what this means is we can use this in other layout methods. So this is Flexbox, so we say wrapper display flex, and then we've got our items there. So the flex container height has been defined by the portrait image. We could do the same with grid. We could say display grid and create a 4-column track grid using the fraction units. Get pretty much the same layout, and we're doing the alignment there with those box alignment properties. So this is done with flex. We say align self center, we say align self flex start, align self flex end. So that's aligning things inside a flex container. And then with grid, we can do align self center, align self start, and align self end. So we're just using start and end rather than flex start and end there. So then we've got a layout that looks pretty much the same whether we're using Flexbox or grid. It demonstrates those alignment properties. So why should we use grid rather than Flexbox? And there's a fairly simple rule around this. Flexbox is essentially for what we call one-dimensional layout. So you're laying things out in a column or a row. Grid is for two-dimensional layout. You want to lay something out in columns and rows at the same time. And here's kind of the basic example of that. I've got a set of items here using Flexbox. My flex basis is 200 pixels. The items can grow and shrink, and I'm allowing them to wrap. And so we get this. So as the flex items wrap, each row becomes a new flex container. And if you're working in columns, you turn row into column. Each time it wraps, that just becomes an entirely new flex container. Space distribution happens across the row. So when we get to that final row that's only got 2 items in, they split the difference. They don't line up underneath card 1 and card 2. You kind of have to break the flexible nature of Flexbox to get those things to line up. So this is where you want to control both rows and columns at the same time. And that's how you do it with grid. So here we're saying repeat autofill, so as many columns as you can get into the container at a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction unit. It'll give you roughly the same thing as we had with Flexbox and the flex basis. And then we get this. So you can see the things here are not spreading out across the bottom. They're lining up in their rows and their columns because we're working in both dimensions at once. Another way of thinking about it is that Flexbox works from the content out. You've got a bunch of stuff and you just say, I want you to space out evenly across this row or across this column. Whereas with grid, you work in the other way around. You're creating a grid and you're saying, right stuff, fit yourself into this grid. So it's kind of the opposite way. If you with Flexbox, you're working content out. With grid, you're kind of working grid and then working in. So there's a quick example of how these things might work together. This is the Tuts Plus website. They have a common navigation pattern that we see. You get these fixed height blocks. The only way to do this with float is to set absolute heights on things. Now, as we know, this is fine as long as you have absolute control of your content. But like in the real world, someone comes along and adds too much stuff into a box and then it all overflows and looks a horrible mess. And I wanted to see if grid could kind of build this sort of pattern in a more responsive sort of way. And it turns out it can. So this is the layout I created, and I'm redefining the grid at 2 breakpoints after that initial mobile width to sort of match the pattern that was used on that site. So while the rows appear fixed at 150 pixels, which is what they were on that site, as soon as I add extra content, the entire row expands down to contain the content. So as well as the box, the news story about angry people at balloon fiestas, that stretches down, but so do the images that are next to it. They have to get taller because that whole row gets taller. So that means everything still lines up at the bottom, but we've got this space for extra content. And this works by using the min-max function in the track sizing for rows. So I mentioned earlier that the grid auto rows property gives a height to our rows. So when we create new rows in the implicit grid. So here I say grid auto rows min-max 150 pixels, be at least as tall as 150 pixels, so don't squish down to nothing. But then have a height of auto, and a height of auto resolves to the height of the content that's in the box. So you're always going to have tracks that are 150 pixels tall, but if you put more than 150 pixels of stuff in, that track is just going to grow to contain the stuff, and everything else across the row will also grow. So you're not going to end up with content overlapping. So we can build these very precise looking layouts that don't blow apart if we get more stuff in than we were expecting. And then sort of just as a note there, I'm using Flexbox as well inside the areas to push the content to the bottom of cells where I want content aligned. I'm using Flexbox in that basis because I just want to sort of push my content about. Another sort of real world thing, you've got content powered by a CMS. Not all CMSs are very good at stopping people adding more content than expected. So, you know, you come into work and someone has added another news story to the box that wasn't supposed to have another news story. Well, Grid will just create a new row and let it go in. It doesn't look, you know, it's not what you designed, it's not what you wanted, but it's not overlaying the rest of the content. It's not a real mess. You can sort it out. Again, there's kind of tolerance here for the real world of content on the web. Now, Grid and Flexbox, as I mentioned when I was talking about auto placement, there is a possibility to make a horrible mess in terms of accessibility when you have a layout method that lets you reorder your content. And I think it's really important when we start to look at Grid that we also think about what we're doing to the content and what we're doing to our content order for people tabbing around the document and so on. Because it's quite possible to create this kind of disconnect between the source and how it looks. Ideally, Grid should help us make really accessible source documents and then use the power of reordering to display stuff the best way for each breakpoint. There is a real danger that the reordering capability will have people just thinking, well, it doesn't matter anymore, let's just drag things around, and kind of forget about what the source order is like. And potentially worse is because elements only become Grid items or Flex items if they're a direct child of the Flex or Grid container, I kind of worry, and this goes back to my working with Dreamweaver in the past, that there'll be a temptation for authoring tools or potentially JavaScript frameworks to strip semantic markup, sort of making everything flat so everything becomes a direct child of the Grid, which would make it obviously very easy to position things, but wouldn't make for very usable documents. The spec does kind of warn about this. It's in the spec that we shouldn't be reordering things. If you want to reorder things, you should do it in the source as well as in the visual display. But I think we need to start having conversations about how this stuff works with accessibility. And that's something that's happening in the working group as well. But it's something I hope that a lot more people will get involved with. If you want to sort of think about this stuff, Adrian Rosselli's got some examples how Grid and other layout methods work with things like tab order once you've reordered things. And this is a fantastic video from Leonie Watson, who is a screen reader user herself. So she's talking about this accessibility issue. She's talking about Flexbox, but a lot of the things she mentions are exactly the same in Grid, but potentially worse. So, when can we use it? Surely it's years and years away from this being usable in browsers, so let's have a look. Grid is really interesting because it's the first big spec to have shipped since the move away from vendor prefixes to experimental feature flags. Grid has been in development in browsers for over 5 years. If we take a look at Can I Use, you will notice something interesting. At the moment, there is only an implementation live in Internet Explorer and Edge. And that's because this spec came from Microsoft. The original editors of the Grid spec were from Microsoft. It was implemented in IE10 in an experimental way behind a prefix. It's still there, it's still in Edge, it's on the backlog to be updated. You can go and vote to encourage them to update their implementation. I would suggest that you do. But they brought us Grid. I mean, the spec came from Microsoft. I don't think we'd have it at all if it hadn't been for that early implementation. It meant that people like me could start writing about it. And if you look at all that green, that's because Grid is going to ship pretty much the complete level 1 specification, very interoperable, into those browsers in March. That will be Firefox, that will be Chrome, that will be Safari in March. That's huge. That's something that's never happened before. A lot of these examples only worked in Chrome for years behind a flag. That Blink implementation's been underway for several years. It's actually been done not by people at Google, but by a consultancy called Igalia. They're an open source consultancy. Their work has, interestingly, been sponsored by Bloomberg. So you can thank Bloomberg for the fact that Chrome and also WebKit, so Safari, have Grid in. So if you use Chrome 56, you will need to enable the experimental web platform features flag. That's the current Chrome. Chrome 57, Grid will just be live. It'll just be there. And that should be in March. Safari 10.1 also includes grid unflagged. Again, that's probably March, April, something like that. Mozilla also shipping in March. It's currently behind a flag unless you use the developer version or nightly, but that'll be coming out, around the same time. I try and keep this page up to date. It also includes links to the meta bugs for each of the browsers, which is the sort of the big bug that links to all the other bugs as it's getting finished. If you go and look, you'll see that an awful lot of stuff is now done. We're really talking about sort of the edges of this that is sort of getting tidied up. So this has been this huge interoperability effort that we're getting grid in all these browsers at the same time. It's been really very exciting to follow. Grid itself is at candidate recommendation, which in terms of the CSS working group, that kind of means it's finished. But for something to exit candidate recommendation, we need to have 2 interoperable implementations of everything in the spec. We're getting there. There are some chunks of the spec that probably aren't going to get implemented by anyone. But what is being implemented in the browsers is pretty much the same in every browser. The examples I've been showing you, the stuff I've got on my site, all work exactly the same way in those browsers. But of course, what about the old browsers? Now, a lot of you are probably going to find that come April, about 70% of your visitors are going to have grid layout. That overnight, that's just going to happen. That's pretty cool. But obviously there are going to be some people on old browsers. So what about them? Well, CSS has given you a solution. It's called feature queries and the @supports rule. And there's not going to be a browser that supports grid but doesn't support feature queries. In fact, there won't be any new things that come into CSS from now. You can use feature queries to detect. So feature queries are pretty neat. If you've ever used Modernizer, you know how feature queries work. And if you've ever written a media query for like a mobile first design, you know how to use them. So this is a feature query. We're saying we have our code for our non-grid browsers. Then we say @supports display grid. And then we write our grid layout code. And browsers that don't support grid layout, they'll not try and do anything with it. So for feature queries, you want to write your CSS for your browsers that don't have support, then override those properties inside the feature queries. That's a really great article I've linked to there, written by Jen Simmons, that explains how to actually do that. Feature queries are fantastic, and they really do give you a great way to sort of create grid layouts that then aren't going to affect other things. It's worth noting that it's pretty easy to overwrite old stuff with grid because it's a value of display. So if something was already display block or whatever, it'll just be overwritten by grid. Floats don't take effect once something's a grid item, so you don't have to do a huge amount of overwriting to enhance your layout with grid layout. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about that. That's just another example, using feature queries to sort of build up a layout. And something else I would say about old browsers, you don't have to turn your whole layout over to grid. You don't have to say, right, that's it. I'm throwing out Bootstrap. I'm just using grid layout now. Great if you can, if you've got the sort of browsers where you can do that. But you can use grid as an enhancement. Use it for laying out galleries of stuff, laying out products, doing things that you can do in a different way, and then make a really good layout using grid, because you might have 70%, 80% of people very quickly are going to get the cool version, and the others are going to grow into it as their browsers update. So don't think that you have to do everything, go all in. You're going to be able to learn grid layout by doing tiny things with it, and then you'll know how to use it for when you can actually use it for more things and fuller layouts. It really is a great time to start learning this. I have masses and masses of code. I've been working with this for about 5 years. So I've got code, I've got video tutorials at gridbyexample.com. That's where I put the stuff that I build. And I say I'll be tweeting these links and I'll share these slides and things later. So there's loads of examples there. There's also videos of some of the sort of the various bits I've discussed. Also, I'm going to come to the pub for a bit. I did get up at 4 o'clock this morning to fly here, so I'm not sure how long I will last at the pub and how sensible I'll be. But if you think of a question later, and most of these questions about grid tend to be best answered in code. I've got this Ask Me Anything. So it's GitHub issues. You can go there, you can post an issue saying, oh look, I've built this in CodePen, it looks a mess, what's going on with it? And I'll have a look. It's handy for me as a CSS working group member to answer these questions, because if there are things we can't answer or if the spec isn't very descriptive, it's useful to know. So I'm very happy to answer questions that you post there. So do, and if you can post a code example, that really, really helps. And because Grid is about to ship, this is a very good time to report any browser bugs. If you find anything, I've written up some notes. This is David Barron from Mozilla saying, you've got a couple of weeks. Please let us know if you find any bugs. If you do find something, if you think you've found something and you want to ask me, do. I'll have a look and see if I can confirm it's a bug. And that link just is some notes I made about reporting bugs in browsers. We can all report bugs in browsers. It's really helpful. It makes the web better for everybody. So thank you very, very much. My slides and stuff are there. I'm at Rachel Andrew on Twitter, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
So I have a microphone, so who has the first question? Do we have any questions? And I'll pass this to you. Right, nice. The furthest corner. I could do with the exercise, in fairness.
So we've got the support queries, which work great for replacing things with a display block layout or something like that. But for layouts that can't do that, is there any polyfills or anything like that that exist?
There is a polyfill. It's very old. It's out of date. I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't try and polyfill Grid. If you try and polyfill, if you're trying to do like your whole layout and polyfill that, that's going to be really janky and jiggly and nasty. I think if you've got a layout that really needs, kind of full support, right back, then you're going to have to use older layout methods. I think that's the sort of pragmatic solution. I mean, I'm using this stuff and will be. I mean, our CMS perch, we have to support back to IE9 because people put that in front of clients with IE9. I know the pain. There's no ivory tower here, So like, I'm like just really carefully using Flexbox and hoping it's not all going to break. So yeah, I think I wouldn't try and polyfill Grid because it's not going to work that well. I mean, we'll see what people come up with, and maybe on a small element basis you could do that. It's not, but if you're talking full layout, it's going to get really jiggly and nasty, I think.
Any more for any more? Oh, you're not too far away. That's fine.
Keeps you fit.
Yeah, I feel like Annika Rice. Maybe I don't look like Annika Rice.
So whatever Grid can do, I could see that there is a code share between Grid and Flexbox, and it looks like a lot of browsers now support Flexbox as well. And can we do with whatever Grid does, including the responsiveness, ordering, etc., using Flexbox and positioning? Is it possible?
No, I mean there's stuff in Grid that just doesn't exist in other layout methods. You could use though Flexbox you could enhance Flexbox with Grid quite easily because again, another value of the display property. So you can have something, and actually the example I linked to, I've done exactly that. I've used Flexbox and then I've enhanced it further using Grid. So if you're kind of clever with the layout methods, because they're sharing properties, things like alignment and stuff, you could have something that gets pretty well with Flexbox, and then you really tighten it up with Grid. I think that's the sort of stuff that is the kind of pragmatic way of working as we're sort of getting more and more stuff with support. Using it as an enhancement.
Is it like, can we use both Grid as well as Flexbox layout inside like nested Grid and nested Flexbox?
Yep, yeah. So you can nest grids. So you can have, an item that is a Grid item. You can then declare display Grid on it and then build a Grid inside it. Or you could say display Flex and use Flex items inside it. So, I think as we start to use it, we're going to realise which is best to use where, and sort of play around with that. I'm really excited actually to see how people use it in kind of the real world rather than just all the experiments that I've been building.
So last question. What is the performance difference does it take much CPU or something like that?
Grid's looking really good. There was the implementers at Igalia were doing some performance testing and we're coming up with some really good results. It's certainly, there's an issue with Flexbox when you try and do Grid-like stuff, you get this kind of jiggling thing as it all loads in, because it's good the way it calculates stuff. You don't have that with Grid because you're sort of saying, well, here's my Grid and I'm putting my stuff into it, rather than having to work things out on a row-by-row basis. So that content shifting thing you get with Flexbox, you're not going to get with Grid. And obviously it's been built to be as performant as possible. And yeah, I mean there are. I've certainly got links that I can post around on that say Agalia were doing on testing, but it's certainly looking pretty speedy and for your average sort of websites and things.
Thanks, man. Hiya. Does this by any chance work with any email clients?
I wouldn't have thought so.
I mean, you've got to ask.
you know what you want there? You want tables. You want tables for email clients. Yeah.
I guess tables are Liz then.
Email is a terrible, terrible thing.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Oh. So there we go. Let you lot do the work. I'll pass that down.
Does this mean that the mantra of mobile first, we now need to think accessibility first and then just build on that? Is that where we're going with this?
I think generally thinking accessibility first is a good way to start. What works in terms of the document and in terms of the different ways. And the biggest issue with Grid isn't things like screen readers so much, I think, as in people who keyboard navigate. I keyboard navigate a lot because I'm kind of pretty much one-handed. I broke my elbow. So I tab around documents all the time. And it's Flexbox, you can end up essentially destroying the content order by moving things around. Obviously with Grid you can do that in 2 dimensions, so you could end up with a situation where you tab to 2 items and then you end up like right down the bottom of the page and then you back up again, and that's going to be pretty horrible. So that stuff is really still being worked out, and I think it's a conversation that's going to be ongoing. But I think test this stuff, and if you are reordering things, just make sure you're not just doing it for the visuals. Sort of if that thing needs to be elsewhere in the document, move it in the source rather than just sort of thinking, I can just move it because I'm using Grid, I can put it down here. So it's kind of it's another level of care we need to take in terms of how people are using our stuff. But I think it's something that we have to kind of be working out, and it's something that the working group are thinking about as well.
So with this grid layout, you can't just say, right, I want tab orders to be left to right and then down. You can't do that.
No, and there's this kind of a debate at the moment actually with Flexbox. Firefox has what is a bug, but I think a lot of people think they're doing it the right way. They're actually reordering things. They're reordering the tab order based on the visual display order so if you say, I want my items to run from right to left, Firefox will work that way around, which actually is a bug when you look at what the spec says, but a lot of people say, well, actually we should follow the visual order. So I think this stuff may change. It's certainly worth thinking about and certainly testing if you're doing a lot of reordering. I say it's when you start reordering things, or if you start pulling things out of DOM order with autoflow, it becomes a problem. You can do, but I mean that you've then got to be very careful to do everything if you start. So.
Another one here.
Sorry. Is it supported by any preprocessors at the moment, like some of the declarations?
SAS supports Grid. They shipped it. There was an issue with SAS, I think, with the named line syntax, and their recent release fixed it. So you can use preprocessing this stuff. I think there are also some post-CSS type things to write Grid with different syntaxes and stuff, but I haven't really looked into that.
Are any parts of this animatable, and do you have any examples if it is?
Right, so you can animate Grid tracks, because you can only animate things where there is like a between state. So what you can't do is like animate an item between cells and things, because there isn't a between state for that. We don't really know what that would look like. But you can animate the tracks and so on. So you can sort of play around with that. You can certainly do things around animations. But I think a lot of people think they should be able to kind of just slide things around, but that's not going to work because we don't have an in-between state for that.
We all good? Right, well, thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you.